that I wanted to make onto a canvas,
Right.
especially a big canvas. Doing that via silkscreen, it just wasn't possible. Just to get the screen alone made would have made, I would have been broke. You know, I couldn't
Right.
couldn't
Right.
afford to do it. And I was clicking around on the internet one day. I don't even remember why, and I came across this. I somehow it was like an ad or something came up for like one of the art supply stores, something about like a acrylic transfer process. And what another thing I did in LA is I was an art teacher for kids at the Armory Center for the Arts, and we learned all of these really kind of kid friendly, cleanup friendly ways to work with images to let kids have something. A lot of times with kids at a certain age, they're really self-conscious about what they're making because it needs to look a certain way. But
Right.
if you let them like pick a photo of something and you transfer that photo and kind of create that sense of remove of it being a photo and then let them play with it and manipulate it, that they're a lot less self-conscious about it, and they kind of open up a little more to the process. And it's like it hit me like a bolt of lightning. He's like, all right, I'm gonna make these, I'm gonna print them out, and I'm gonna transfer this, you know, composition. I just kind of refer to them as the digital compositions. I'm gonna print the digital composition out big, and then transfer it to a big painting. So as like to make one painting, I had two separate processes happening simultaneously. There was the process of dealing with the paint and the materials on the canvas, and then there was the process of developing the image that would ultimately be transferred to the painting. And I did that for years, and that work and that process is what I think defines my time in New York.
Well, I think that process is very much in your work today. I mean, would you disagree with that?
Yes and no. So I don't want to jump too far ahead on the timeline, but once I got to Rhode Island, as I was leaving Brooklyn, I was trying to find ways to take apart, because this is one thing I always do constantly over a certain amount of time is, and in my view, I'll just say, as an artist, I think it's important that I'm always self-critical of my own work and always try to see where I can go, whether it's a successful direction or not. I feel like I always have to be going somewhere. I can't just make the same kind of work over and over again.
No.
Which, you know, helps and hurts depending on how you look at it. But when I got to Rhode Island, I was actively trying to, I don't know if diminish is the right word, but like pare down or like take away or set aside the impact or the dominance of the transfer process of the work. Because two things were happening. One, from my point of view, for like the way I was looking at it, thinking about it, and feeling about that work. One thing, with the way that transfer process worked, it really removed the surface of the painting and transformed it into something else, where I thought you would lose the touch of paint. And what I mean by that is the inherent kind of feel or touch of an artist hand using a brush to move the paint across the surface.
Sure.
But also, I wanted to kind of break up the surface more. You know, I didn't want to get, and I also didn't want to get caught in the trap of a singular process. One thing I think that was being lost on people looking at it is I was looking at it as a way to, in my own way of thinking about it, synthesize abstraction, if you want to use like a musical term, in the way that like an electronic artist would use a synthesizer. You start with a signal, and then you manipulate that signal, that sound signal, through various filters and effects to create a new sound, right? And that's kind of what I was trying to do with the computer. I had this initial painting photographed, processed through the computer, printed out, and then through another process transferred on. So transforming, the original thing or the source thing. Right. A lot of that was being lost. More people were more interested in just the process itself, like the mechanics of how it was made. And that to me was less interesting. It's like, well, you're missing the point if you're really more concerned with how the thing was made. So, which, I always lied to everybody that asked how I did it, because, well, no one at the time was really making work with transfer at the time. And I knew, like, a good idea is hard to come by. And I knew, some people might want to bite on it a little bit.
Great chefs don't share their ingredients. They always tweak their recipe just a little bit so no one can replicate it.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is that, like, we're sitting here talking about, we're having a dialogue about material and process and the object, and from an abstract or a theoretical standpoint, that's a conversation that we can have. But I think for maybe some of our listeners, I'm interested in how, if we can kind of like jump ahead in some of the questioning, is like, how is surfing now woven into this, even if it's an abstract or conceptual way of driving what you're attempting to do? Because one of the question that I was thinking of was like, there's a whole genre of surf art, and the legacy and history of surfing and art. And then you're coming at art from a personal history of surfing and how that may kind of like filter into your process. So how is that, influencing each other?
Well, I'll say something, maybe kind of bold, and I'll say I don't think it ever left. I think the surfing was always there. And if I think back to the work I was making in Los Angeles with those big brushstroke paintings, the one thing everyone always commented on, like the common thing, is the movement. That when they looked at those paintings, they felt a movement, like within their body, like it was a movement.
For sure.
And they would try to use like a language that made sense to them. Like some people talked about dancing, some people talked about, riding down the hill on a bike really fast. That kind of like, like a G-force kind of movement. But I would argue that I was bringing surfing with me, even though I wasn't surfing. The experience of surfing.
Right. I mean, like we can sit here and talk about material and process and transfer and stuff like that. But if we had somebody in the gallery viewing one of your paintings, I know when I look at your paintings, I try to divorce the connect. I try to divorce myself of surfing. I try to get away from the whole idea that you are a surfer, but it's almost impossible because when I look at it, I feel the fluidity. I see the brushstroke. There's a liquidity there. There's this, like, as if you were just like rising up and down a face and moving back and forth and cutting back and coming back around. And, these brushstrokes are communicated through the transfers. And I don't know if that's just me knowing you and then making the connection, or objectively, if you had somebody standing there who did not know that you were a surfer, would they feel the same thing? I'm kind of interested in that because your work does communicate that.
Well, I think it would depends on what you mean by the same thing. The feeling we might connect to is something that we get from surfing, but that same feeling might be connected to something else and someone else.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, what's interesting is Kris was saying that, it was emoting that feeling, even if people hadn't surfed before, they were trying to describe that movement that they were experiencing, which is quite interesting.
Well, I had a friend in LA. It was right before I was leaving for New York, and I had 3 big, like 8-foot paintings in my studio. And she came over to look at them, and she's like, your paintings remind me of icebergs. And that really floored me, because if you think about what an iceberg is, and like how like massive and impactful they are, that's probably one of the best compliments anyone ever paid me. Like, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, it's there was an experience that happened to me once, and it taught me a lot about how, like, your intent and your passion and your experiences that you bring to a work of art may not even be close to what someone else is experiencing. Like I had sold a work of art to a collector, and the collector was like, I want you to come over and see this piece of work installed in my house. And I show up to the, this collector's house, and, we have a very cordial conversation. And I'm like, well, I said to them, I'd love to tell you, all about this work of art. And this person stopped me dead in my tracks and was like, I really don't want you to tell me. And I was shocked. I was like slightly like offended. And this collector decided to say, like, that work of art resonates with me in a very specific and personal way. And I don't want you to ruin that for me. And that was a really important moment, because it made me realize that when anyone is standing in front of a work of art that you have created, that's a very personal experience for them. So I've always been interested in, like, how your work communicates to someone who may not know that you're a surfer.
Well, I certainly want them to have a personal experience, and I don't think the content of the work is specific to surfing. But if you understand, surfing and being a surfer, you'll have a particular experience with the work. I would definitely agree.
Right. For sure. So you're in Rhode Island now, and you, by this point, you have a history, you have a past, you have a portfolio, you've got a career, and you're now embedding yourself into a whole different community, a different culture. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what's happening now?
Well, actually, a lot is happening now. To go back, with like trying to let the transfer go and being in Rhode Island, let me get my thoughts together here, because there's a lot.
Yeah, there is a lot. It's
only really been 6 years, but a lot has happened. So for the first year, being really honest, I struggled with the work, and it's not that I'd not in like time to do it, but just the work that I made wasn't coming out successfully, which is fine. But I did struggle a lot the first year with my work, because any time I move or try to make a shift, the first year or two within that it's really just a lot of experimentation and like seeing what sticks. I wasn't sharing a lot of it. I was just keeping most of it to myself because it wasn't ready. But eventually I kind of came back to the transfer a little bit, but I was doing these really textured monochromes, which I think you've seen, Kris.
Yeah.
I think it's actually the first time you came to my studio up here. I was doing these, it was like very textured paint, but painted all one color and then transferring on top of that.
Yeah, very physical, very tactile.
Yep. And I think that was part, trying to get back to the tactility of painting, which some of those early